Brilliant, excellent. Right, those of you that have done some reading, hopefully the information that I give you now should be fairly straightforward because you should be relatively familiar with some of the key ideas and the key concepts. Those of you that haven't done any reading, you might struggle a little bit, so help yourself by doing some reading before the lecture. You will find it useful. Next week, just to give you the heads up on this, next week we will be covering positivism again very briefly, but I will also be covering essay writing skills. I'll be talking about the assessments. Okay, I'll be talking about the first assessment. It really is quite important that you come next week. Okay, if you miss next week's session, you will be putting yourself at a significant disadvantage in terms of the first assessment. So please make sure you come to next week's session. Okay, you may, if you've not already done so, even though I did ask you to do it next week, if you've not started on your assignment, then you must do so now. Okay, because you will have questions. Now, if you don't start your essay, you're not going to know what questions to ask because you've not started it. So do yourself a favour. If you've not started it, make sure you start it. Okay, so you want to be in a position where you've started your research, where you're thinking about drafts, where you're thinking about outlines, arguments, so on and so forth. Okay, so if you've not started, then you really need to do so before next week. Okay, good. Right. Today we're looking then at positivism. Okay, we're moving on. Now, before we move on from classicism, what I need to identify to you, and this will become clear when we watch a video in a few weeks' time, that when you look at your textbooks, you tend to find that each of these different ideas are kind of compartmentalised. So you get classicism, you get positivism, then you'll get something like Durkheim, functionalism, labelling theory. They're all kind of separated into different chapters. Now, obviously, that's done because of presentation. It's easier to do that. It kind of makes sense, doesn't it? But what you need to bear in mind is that many of these ideas, they overlap. It's not like, one day classicism was popular and all of a sudden somebody said, no, we're not going to consider classicism anymore. The legacy of classicism is enduring. For those of you that were in my seminar last week, we talked about how principles of classicism are still in evidence in our legal system today, in terms of the Sentencing Guideline Council, for example, trying to create proportionality and consistency in sentencing. So these ideas all inform and all influence our criminal justice system today. But at different parts in history, different times in history, they are more or less popular. Okay, now, before I go on to explain in great detail what positivism is, I need to outline a few things to you to start with. Okay, positivism. Now, the first thing that I need to identify to you is that positivism is split into two areas. There is individual positivism and there is sociological positivism. Okay, individual positivism and sociological positivism. Individual positivism is split again into two. Individual positivism is split into biological positivism and psychological positivism. Biological and psychological positivism. Now, this week and next week we will be focusing on this, individual positivism. The few weeks after that we will be discussing sociological positivism. Okay? So that's just to give you an outline of where we're going, okay, in terms of the next few weeks. So today we're looking at individual positivism. Okay, we're going to look at our timeline again in a moment, but the first thing that I need to identify to you is this. I need to flag it up. Is that positivism is a method. It's a method. In your assignment, in your first assignment, you're asked to compare and contrast, or one of the questions is to compare and contrast classicism with positivism. Now, be mindful of this point I'm about to make, because this is the first point of comparison. Classicism is a theory. Classicism is a theory, whereas positivism is a method. It's a method. Okay? But that then begs the question, what type of method is it? Those of you that have done some reading, and let's get you thinking, get you talking, what type of method is it?
Based on scientific approach.
Okay, so it's based on scientific approach. Okay. Right, let's contextualise this then, because as we said last week, in order to understand any development, in order to understand any theory or indeed any method, we must contextualise it, we must put it into context. And the mechanism that we use to do that then is the famous timeline. Okay, so the industrial revolution here. Right, we said that the industrial revolution then brings about fundamental transformation in the nature of social relations. And this is the socio-economic, political and cultural context then. Okay, we find a shift, a reconfiguration that occurs around this time. Incidentally, I should also flag up to you that obviously I put kind of a solid line here. Now, the reconfiguration, this transformation, it takes a period of time, and that period of time is roughly situated around the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so many of the developments we're talking about, particularly classicism last week, they occurred actually before the Industrial Revolution, but this just to give you an idea of where this sits historically. Okay? We noted then that lots of things changed as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Now, one of the consequences of this fundamental transformation in the nature of social relations was that modernity presents us with a range of new problems, a range of distinct problems. So we said that we went from these kind of small communities, these small self-sufficient communities. So if you wanted anything you could possibly want, you would probably get from your own little village, from your own little settlement. You wouldn't need to have a, there's no great cause for you to want to go and trade with other villages, for example. Pretty much most of these communities then were rural, they were self-sufficient, and they were homogenous. Modernity saw the change in the way that people live. So we went from these small rural communities to these big urban metropolises. So we begin to see the emergence of the city as we now know it today. Now the city presents us with a range of distinct problems. So you've got lots of people living in a very small area, and then real practical problems. People literally used to throw their piss and shit onto the streets. So you had rivers of urine, rivers of excrement. Famously, one summer, Parliament was unable to sit because of the stench coming from the River Thames. This creates problems. People used to believe that disease was caused by miasma. It was in the air. So people used to believe that if you were unwell, you would go down to Brighton, you'd go down to the coast where the air was clear and the air was fresh, and it was meant to be good for your health. So people believed that diseases were transferred through the air. Now, these are real problems then. If you've got rivers of piss and rivers of shit, literally you've got loads of horses as well, so you've got extra horses. The city is a shithole. It's a not a very nice place to be. There is disease, there is squalor, there is huge amounts of poverty that we can't really imagine. So the city has these distinct problems. Now, there is one thing that begins to provide answers for some of the problems presented by modernity. And one of the developments that begins to provide answers for the problems of modernity is this: science. You will recall I used this explanation about the volcano erupting, the explanation in pre-modernity situated in revelation or in tradition or in religion. This begins to get replaced by explanations based on science. Increasingly, science begins to provide answers for the problems of modernity. So we have things like the invention of the steam engine. Science brought about the invention of the steam engine. Science brings about the use of vaccines for diseases. So science increasingly becomes important. So it's not then surprising that if you look around and you see all of these problems in society, and you see science being used effectively as a way of dealing with these problems, that people begin to think, well, hold on a minute, maybe we can apply the method of the scientific approach to understanding human behaviour or human action. So in this context, it sort of makes sense then, doesn't it, that people begin to move and look towards the natural sciences or the method of the natural sciences and begin to ask, well, maybe this method of the natural sciences can be applied to human nature. Okay, now before we go on to explore that in more detail, we need to have a clearer idea of what this scientific approach is then. What is it that this new mechanism of exploring things, what is it actually does? Well, can you tell me? There's lots of different key tenets of the scientific approach. Just give me some ideas when we discuss it.
It has to be based on data, or it has to provide facts.
Okay, data, facts. Okay, we're going to write some of these things down and then we'll discuss them. So data, facts.
Has to be tested. Has to be tested.
Okay, testable, brilliant. Testable. Vicky?
Observation.
Observation. Good. You're being lazy at the moment. You're just throwing a word at me and expecting me to understand what you mean. So I'm going to come back to you and ask you what you mean by observation. Anything else? Experiment, brilliant. Experiment. Variables. You're being lazy as well. Throwing a word at me and expecting me to understand what you mean. I'm going to come back to you in a moment as well and ask you to explain what you mean by variables. Are you putting your hand up or are you having a stretch? Just having a stretch. Monday morning stretch. Nothing better than a good old Monday morning stretch. Okay. What are the principles? Perhaps one of the most important is this, prediction. Okay, now let me give you an example of what we mean by a scientific approach before we look at all of these different things. Scientists, as you say, they carry out experiments, don't they? Experiments where they isolate variables in order to try to produce data that is observable in an objective way. Okay, so every time you do this experiment, you can predict the results. The same thing will happen again and again and again. Okay, if you use the same variables. So, I'm no scientist, so let's use this example here. I've got a Bunsen burner, okay, and we've got here we've got a bowl of water. Okay, we're going to seal the bowl of water. We're going to heat it, and out of that water, if we heat it, okay, now if we heat that water, there's water, and we isolate the container, what we will get out of it is 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen. Yeah? So H2O. So we know then every time that we repeat that experiment, we will get the same answer. So we can predict then, can't we? Yeah? That water is comprised of 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen. Okay, that's a scientific test then, isn't it? Well, the idea is then is that we can apply this method, the method of the natural sciences, to exploring human behaviour. Okay? So we do all of these things here. So let's look at these in a bit more detail. Right, Vicky, you said observation, didn't you?
Yeah.
Well, what do you mean by that then? Why is that important for this scientific method?
Because investigation needs to be carried out for whatever you are looking to identify.
There's something else about observation that's important here. What type of observation are we referring to here? What makes it scientific? You're begging the question in your own favour a little bit there. Okay, right, I'm going to give you another example. You'll remember this. Okay, what's that?
A bumblebee.
It's a bumblebee. It's a poorly drawn bumblebee, but it's a bumblebee nevertheless. Right, it's a bumblebee. Right, now what we're going to do here is I'm going to explain to you the type of observation that a scientific approach seeks to employ. There's a bumblebee, okay? There's a beautiful bumblebee. Let's get a pen that works. There's a green person. another green person, and another green person. Right, there's a poet, a child, and a gardener. Okay. Now, the poet looks at the bumblebee, and the poet says that the purpose of the bumblebee is to look beautiful. Because it's the sort of thing that poets say, isn't it? Bumblebee's beautiful, right? So the purpose of the bumblebee is to look beautiful. The child is asked, what is the purpose of the bumblebee? The child said that the purpose of the bumblebee is to sting people, because the child has been stung by a bee in the past. The gardener says that the purpose of the bumblebee is to help pollinate plants. That's the purpose of the bumblebee. Now there's two types of knowledge here. There's two types of knowledge that we can adduce from this scenario. There is what we call subjective knowledge, and there is what we call objective knowledge. Okay? So objective and subjective knowledge. Right, now you've got to consider this. So what aspect of this scenario can we say is objective knowledge, and which part is subjective knowledge?
Objective knowledge is the knowledge of gardener.
Pardon?
Objective knowledge is the knowledge of gardener.
Why do you say it's the knowledge of the gardener?
Because it's truth, isn't it?
Because it's true. Why is it true? What makes it true?
It's science. I mean, all the experiments that were made, they proved that
It can be proved, it can be tested. Well, it can be proved and tested that the purpose of the bumblebee is to sting people. It can be proved that the purpose of the bumblebee is to look beautiful.
no, you cannot prove. You cannot prove that.
You can certainly prove that the purpose of the bumblebee is to sting people, because it stings people. We can observe that, can't we? I can see what you're saying. I'll come back to you, because you're kind of right. You're kind of right. It's a bit of a trick question. These people are asked individually their opinion. They're asked their opinion. What is the purpose of the bumblebee? And what do? They all give an opinion. Right. The opinions that they give, are they the same?
No.
No, they're different. So they have different values and different ways of answering this question of what the purpose of a bumblebee is. What piece of knowledge is shared amongst them? What piece of knowledge do they not contest?
Objective knowledge.
That it is objective knowledge, because it's knowledge that's held between them they don't contest. But what thing do they all agree on? That it's a bumblebee. Nobody's saying it's a wasp. Nobody's saying in actual fact it's a moth. They're all agreeing that it's a bumblebee. Right. Objective knowledge then is knowledge that's shared and held in common. Okay? It's observable knowledge. Now I'm going to give you another example of this in a couple of weeks' time. So if you don't understand this at this stage, it will become a bit clearer. And I don't want to give you the other example yet, because it fits what we're going to look at in a couple of weeks. Now, obviously, here then there are two types of knowledge, objective and subjective knowledge. The objective knowledge then isn't an opinion, it's not a why, it's not a value, it's not a value. Okay? It's not a why. It simply is. It exists independently of the opinions of the observers. So this is objective knowledge. Now, you said that perhaps the opinion given by the gardener was potentially more scientific. Well, you're absolutely right. It is more scientific because it's testable, isn't it? We can test whether or not bumblebees do actually pollinate plants. Everyone getting the idea here? Yeah? Okay, so the point then is that the purpose of a scientific method is to reveal objective knowledge. So it's something that exists independently or separate to the individual. You don't need to ask the individual. So cancer exists independent, doesn't it? The world rotates. It's driven by kind of natural forces. It's beyond our perception. It's beyond our will. Yeah? Is this making sense? Is this making sense? Nod or shake your head. Right. Put your hand up if you don't understand this. You don't understand it, right? If you don't understand it, there's a good few other people that don't, so well done for being honest there. Right, okay. The point here is that the scientific method seeks to reveal objective knowledge. There are two types of knowledge, objective and subjective. the objective, okay, is knowledge that exists external to individuals, so it's external. Subjective knowledge is internal. So objective knowledge exists beyond the individual, it's separate from the individual. Let me give you an example. At 5 o'clock this evening, I know you're all going to be here at 5 o'clock because you're all going to be in the library working away on your assignments. But when you decide that you're going to go home at 5 o'clock, if you ride a bicycle or you go on the tube, there's one thing you know is going to happen. What's going to happen?
Very crowded.
It's going to be busy. It's rush hour, isn't it? Now, rush hour exists independently of you, doesn't it? Okay, it's not a value. It's not a purpose from you. It's not a value. So when it exists, it's something that exists independently of you. So we can use a scientific approach then to make a statement of objective knowledge. And that statement about objective knowledge is that every day, Monday to Friday, between, say, 5 o'clock and 7 o'clock, there will be a rush hour. It will be really, really busy. Now, that's something that happens. It exists independently of your will. Yeah? So it's something that happens. So that's objective knowledge. Yeah? Subjective knowledge is the purpose, the why, it's somebody's opinion, if you like. It's a value. So then, is this making a bit more sense now? Right, so the purpose here then is that the purpose of the point here is that the purpose of this scientific method, of this method called positivism, seeks to reveal objective knowledge. It seeks to reveal objective truths. So they're saying then that we can apply, the positivists are saying that we can apply this method of the natural sciences to understanding human behaviour. There are then factors, forces that exist independently of us. And our task as positivists then is to reveal these forces, these external forces.
And make predictions?
Yeah, we can make predictions, yeah. So I can make the prediction now that between 5 and 7 o'clock this evening, if you're going to get on the tube, it's going to be bloody crowded. Okay, I'm able to make a prediction about that, aren't I? And that prediction will happen again and again and again until there's an exception. It won't happen on Christmas Day, for example. It will happen on Boxing Day, because everyone will be going out spending all their money they've got for Christmas on sale in Oxford Street. Obviously, you'll be busy home working on your assignments. Okay, so everybody get the point about the bumblebee then, yeah? Everyone understanding the general principles. So this idea then is that science begins to provide answers. Okay? People look towards this scientific method and say that we can apply this scientific method to humans, to human action. And the purpose is to reveal these external forces. Okay. Any questions on that before we move on? No? Okay. We can explore this we will explore it in a bit more detail in the seminars as well. So let's go back to this. We noted then that during this period then, classicist frameworks of explanation were pretty much in the ascendancy. Okay? People thought that if we have a clear, consistent, coherent legal system, this would eventually reduce crime. You've got to remember that when we looked at classicism, okay, what's the key thing that classicism sought to do in terms of crime? It sought to control it through deterrence, wasn't it? To control crime. Okay, so it was correctionist in nature. Now, increasingly people begin to look at the legal system and think, well, this approach for dealing with crime, to control crime, isn't actually working. This approach of dealing with crime has failed. Okay, this was the accusation that was made by positivists. They said that you've got to remember that classicists were all about a kind of rights-based approach. This over-concentration on the rights of suspects was inhibiting the quest to find the causes of crime. Okay? So there was a general accusation then that this approach to dealing with crime, to controlling crime, had failed. The positivists said, that this approach was not empirical enough. It was not situated within this scientific approach. It was not empirical. What we need then is an empirical way of exploring crime and criminality. This would help us to reveal the causes of crime. We need a much more scientific, a much more rigorous approach to understanding the causes of crime, a much more empirical approach, not this kind of theoretical approach that the classicists were adopting. They said then that there's an over-concentration on the rights of the offender, and this inhibits the quest to find the causes of crime. So what we find then is a significant shift in this focus. There's a significant shift in focus. So the classicists are focusing on the offence, whereas the positivists now are focusing on the offender. So already we've now identified a second difference between classicism and positivism, in addition to the one I mentioned right at the outset. So there's a significant shift in focus. You've got to remember, let me just clarify this point. Obviously under classicism, all of the focus, all the attention, is looking at the offence. What crime has been committed? Okay? And once you've established what crime has been committed, so it's a very legal definition, what crime has been committed, so therefore we will apply a proportionate sentence, okay, in order to deter other people. Okay, so here then the focus is on the offence. Here, on the positivism, the focus is on the offender. The positivists are saying that there's something different about criminals. There's something different about criminals. They are not like the rest of us. Okay? Criminals are somehow different. They are, to use their point, differentiated. Under classicism, we notice that pretty much we're all criminals, aren't we? Some are deterred, others aren't deterred. Some of us act on free will and rationality, others make irrational decisions, they decide to break the law. Well, the positivists are saying that criminals are very different to the rest of us. Okay, let's look at this in a bit more detail now. Let's zoom in on what they're trying to say. Okay, so they're saying that criminals are somehow different from the rest of us. They're not the same. So how do they do this? Well, do you remember we said that when we looked at classicism, all theories make assumptions, don't they? They make assumptions about the nature of human action. What were the assumptions, just to be clear, what were the assumptions that classicists made? We outlined them over on this board last week.
They're all equal?
Okay, so equality. Yeah. There's lots of them.
Rationality?
Rationality, we're all endowed with the ability to make choices.
All can be easily
Sorry? Hedonism. Okay, we're all motivated by the desire to increase our pleasure and to avoid pain. And there's other
proportion.
Voluntarism. Proportionality isn't. It's not an assumption about human nature. It's a key principle that they adopt. You're kind of right, but it's not an assumption about human action. Voluntarism. Okay, so we're able to make free will choices. What else?
Manipulation.
Manipulability, brilliant. Okay, right. These are assumptions. They are all assumptions. They provide explanations, but they are still an assumption. What's the problem with assumptions?
They're too narrow.
These could be too narrow, but what's the problem when we make assumptions?
We cannot put everybody in the line. We cannot generalize.
There's sometimes the exception to the rule. They are assumptions. They need to be proved, don't they, really? They need to be assessed. They need to be established. So, from a positivistic method, we need to assess, we need to be able to prove the assumptions that we're making. Now, all theories then, they make assumptions. Now, our task, your task as criminologists, is to assess the veracity of these assumptions, to assess how persuasive they are. We kind of did that. We're doing that in the seminars when we're assessing how persuasive we find these, how persuasive they are. So, likewise then, Positivists also make assumptions about the nature of human action. Does anybody know what assumptions the positivists make about the nature of human action?
We are born criminals?
No.
That's not an assumption about human action. That's a conclusion they draw. That's where they end up. You're kind of 2 steps in front of us in that one.
We are on the
Deficiency. Deficiency, you mean it's pathology.
What about the time?
Is that what you mean? What you mean doing that? What we're basically saying is that there's something wrong with criminals. Pathology means something wrong. So they're sick, they're ill. They are not the same as the rest of us. They are variations of the norm. Okay? There's something wrong with them. So not only is there something wrong with them, not only is there this assumption of pathology.
Physicalities, so positive features.
This is where we come to this bit here. Hold on to it. Yeah, you're absolutely, again, you're a couple of steps ahead of us at the moment. We're looking at the assumptions, okay? And you're right, they do situate this pathology in either biology or psychology. That's what they do. They say that criminals are somehow, there's something wrong with them, either biologically or psychologically. We'll explore those in a bit more detail next week. We're just setting the scene, we're mapping the terrain, trying to assess what the assumptions are. So there's something wrong with criminals. Not only is there something wrong with them, there's something different. They are not like the rest of us. Unlike the classicists who adopt this principle of voluntarism, brilliant, they focus on this notion, determinism. They say that behaviour is determined. Behaviour is caused. It's caused by one of these 2 things, either biology or psychology. Okay? So you tend to find then that under individual positivism, there are 2 strains. There is an explanation that says that individuals are somehow, there's something biologically wrong, biologically different, or their biology determines them, or psychologically there's something wrong with them, different with them, and they're determined by these psychological factors. So these factors then exist independently of the individual. And they said then that we can identify these pathologies, we can identify what makes criminals different, these factors that determine their behaviour. Okay, we can identify these using this scientific approach. Bearing in mind that science is providing answers for all of these questions in society. Is this making sense so far? Everyone with me? Good, right, okay, so pathology, differentiation and determinism then. These are the factors, these are the assumptions that they make about the nature of human action. Now already we can compare some of these, and we can see how they stand. Like this notion of determinism then. We said that under classicism, people are endowed with the ability to make choices. That we all have reason and rationality to make choices. Now, the positivists, on the other hand, are saying that no, you don't have the ability to make choices. Some of us are predisposed towards certain things, and in this case, predisposed towards criminality. Okay, so you're more likely to be predisposed. Now, this is probably a good point to pause and to consider some of the points we're making here, because some of you are probably adopting a very strict kind of way of looking at this. You might be thinking, well, our behaviour doesn't totally determine what we're doing, not in the way that the natural sciences works. What you've got to remember here is they're saying that we should apply the method of the natural sciences to understanding human action or human behaviour. Now, we are not the same as elements, are we? We're not the same as earth, wind, fire. We have, what do we have that sets us apart from this desk?
Consciousness? We
have consciousness, we have awareness, don't we? That means then that makes us different from a stone or from a rock, doesn't it? Yeah? We have an ability to we're driven by motives, we have an opinion. So what you tend to find then is that this approach isn't as strict, it's not as straightforward as in a strict scientific method. So they're saying then that we're able to draw conclusions from this. We're able to look at, we're able to draw meaningful conclusions, but there will be differences within that. Okay? Does this make sense? I'll explain that. Right, so they're saying then that there will be slight differences because obviously humans are not the same as rocks. You know, we have an element of free will anyway. Okay, so pathology, differentiation, and determinism. These are the key points. Now, we said that classicists has clear, from these assumptions about the nature of human action, there is a clear policy that flows from this. We talked about this in my 2 seminar groups last week. What is policy? What do we mean by policy? I remember. Somebody said something over here. That is a policy. What do we mean by policy? You're absolutely right to say that punishment must fit the crime. That is a policy that comes from it. Right, that's an example of policy. But what is policy? Rules.
It's a way of fighting with a crime.
It's a way of.
Like fighting is a crime.
Not all policy is about fighting crime. It might be about.
Controlling crime.
That would be an approach, a policy approach based on controlling crime.
Is that what the government want to do and what? How they want to control crime? And what
Government often initiate policy, but what do we mean by policy? A framework to work from. Okay. Not really. Well, obviously they believe that it's right, otherwise they wouldn't introduce it, would they?
Is it the law that the courts how they treat?
Policy is often implemented through mechanisms like the law, but it's a framework of doing something, isn't it? It's something that flows from the theory. Okay, so something that flows from these assumptions then are these points about proportionality, punishments fitting the crime, for example. Yeah? What do you think the policy of this approach is? What flows from this? What practical development do you think this approach advocates?
Like you would want to get rid of the roots of crime and like the crime.
Right, okay, so this then, one of the policy that comes from this is punishment, isn't it? Is that you punish individuals in order to manipulate people into believing that the potential reward for a crime is not outweighed by the benefits. Okay? The punishment will outweigh the potential rewards. So we use that kind of balancing mechanism, didn't we, to look at that. Through deterrence, again, punishment through deterrence here. What's the policy that would flow through this? If you're saying then that there's something wrong, something different with criminals and they're predisposed, what would you do? Treatment, excellent. Okay, so the policy. So we're saying that we're showing that there is a difference in terms of policy that flows from these two approaches as well. This provides us with a very much legal definition of what crime is. Positivists, their definition is a social definition of what a criminal is. So there's a fundamental shift in focus, a focus away from the offence to the offender. So let's go back to what we said at the beginning here then, the different strands, biological and psychological. So there are two strands here then of positivism. There's a biological and there's a psychological. There's something either biologically wrong or psychologically wrong. In terms of this, biological, the people that are advocates of this approach say that there is an outward sign of an inborn criminal nature. There's an outward sign of an inborn criminal nature. We can tell criminals simply by their physical appearance, by the way that they look. There's something about the way they look that we can observe in this objective, scientific way. There's something different about them biologically. There's an outward sign of inborn criminal nature. The psychological approach is that there is something different about the experiences that a criminal could have. There's something wrong with their experiences. Often they situate these experiences in early childhood. So, for example, we'll look at this in much more detail next week. If a child has been separated from its mother in the early years, this experience, this bad experience, will increase the likelihood, objectively speaking, will increase the likelihood of that individual becoming a criminal, okay, of violating laws. So, biological and psychological explanations of the causes of crime. So, outward signs of an inborn criminal nature and pathological experiences. Okay, that's essentially the difference. Now, next week we'll look at these in much more detail. We'll look at the difference between, we'll look at some of the writers who advocate the biological approach, and we'll look at people that advocate the psychological approach. Everyone with me so far? Okay, let's go back now to this, the context then. Okay, we need to understand how all of this now sits with this. And we've made a couple of really important points, and I'm just going to re-emphasise. Firstly then, there's a general belief that the classicist project had failed. Okay, its attempt to control crime, but we've got to remember, it's correctionist in approach, isn't it? Okay, it believes that we can control crime through having this clear, coherent, consistent framework of sentencing. That's failed. There's an over-concentration on the rights of offenders. That's failed as well. So now people are moving towards this much more scientific explanation. This explanation that draws from this positivistic method, adopts the approach of applying the method of sciences to human action. Okay, so there's something else that's also happening here then. What other factors do you think push into this process? What are the other drivers? Well, the other drivers are caused by the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so modernity creates or presents us with distinct problems, distinct risks. Things like, poor sanitary, poor health, disease, squalor. Technology is being used to create a variety of new wonderful inventions, like steam engine, for example. And all of these things then are drivers of modernity. So this approach then is very much part of the time. It's very much situated within modernity. Those of you that have done some reading on this, hopefully you would be considering the policy that comes from this, these ideas of treatment. Okay, now we need to contextualise this, and we need to understand the impact, potential implications of the policy. Now some of you are probably thinking, well, I've done a reading on this, and I've read what Lombrosso's got to say, I've read what Gareth Allen's got to say, and it all sounds a bit far-fetched, quite frankly, this idea that there's an outward sign of an inborn criminal nature. And you might think, well, I'm just going to dismiss this as a load of old nonsense. This is all kind of, sort of made some sense back then. Should we dismiss these ideas out of hand? Let's just try and get this out of the way. Let's try and address it, because it's really important that we understand the implications of this approach for policy.
So it's very important because we started to rehabilitate people.
Well, it is important because if you're working on this basis that something wrong with criminals, you could work on the basis that we perhaps can treat them. Or there's a much more hardline approach that you can take to this. If you're a criminal, if I can identify and I can show scientifically that you've got all of the outward signs of an inborn criminal nature, okay, and I can
kill them.
Why should I spend lots of money on treating you when it might be easy for me to identify if you have this gene in your body at an early age and have you aborted before you're even born? Yeah. You're laughing. You laugh because this isn't funny, because this was actually adopted in 1939 to 1945 by somebody called Hitler. The Nazi project was all about eugenics. It was all about this idea that there are differences between us. Okay? That there is a superior race, which, as Hitler said, was the Germanic race, okay, the Aryan race, which by implication means if there's a superior race, there must also be an inferior race as well. And he believed then that in order to stop the contamination of the gene pool by races that he saw as inferior, Jews for example, Romany gypsies were seen as inferior, anyone that had any form of disability was seen as, anyone that had any physical disability was seen as inferior. You would either sterilise them or you would exterminate them. These ideas are quite dangerous, okay? So these ideas then were part of this movement. They were adopted by the eugenics movement. And there was a massive movement, a massive eugenics movement in the turn of the 20th century. People actually believed that there was a hierarchy of races. White people were superior to black people. Asian people were inferior. Okay? There was a hierarchy of ethnicity. You've got to remember the work of Darwin, Darwin's work on the origin of the species. People are beginning to map the human genome now. Okay? We know an awful lot more about, science is being used more and more and more to map out the human genome. So if we can identify if there's a defective gene, there's all sorts of things that we can do, isn't there? We can either treat them, we can sterilise them, we can abort them, we can exterminate them. Has anybody seen the film Clockwork Orange? Right, really powerful film. If you've not seen it, have a look at it. In that film, there's a scene towards the end where these kind of approaches are adopted. Obviously, it's a fantasy film, it's fiction, it's not true. But it's a kind of vision of utopia gone wrong. It's a vision of dystopia, in fact. One of the key characters in this film, he is subjected to mind alteration treatment. I won't tell you too much about it, but have a look at the film. It's actually really disturbing in part. There's a rape scene in there as well, which is particularly disturbing. But it's some of the principles, some of the policy echoes what we're talking about here. Okay, so it's not funny. This sort of thing is really, really important. We really need to consider it. Okay, it's not like this is stuff that's dated, it's situated in the 18th, 19th century, and therefore we ought to dismiss it. We need to be able to assess this. Going back to the context then, okay, all of this context is driving these developments. Okay, it's all situated by these developments. We have the invention of photography in the late 1900s, 1870s. The invention of photography makes it an awful lot easier to carry out this project. Because you can imagine in these times, before photography, if you were a criminal, there's no way that the state can actually identify who you are, because there's no mechanism of capturing your image. So they might write down a few things about your height, but without actually colouring your eyes, colouring your hair, but that doesn't really, you can't really capture somebody in that way. So photography enabled people, particularly the police, to be able to positively verify who somebody was. There's famous cases of people being arrested by the police and saying, no, it wasn't me, it's my brother, he looks a little bit like me. And there's no way that you can prove it. You've all heard of the expression mugshot. Yeah? You've all got mugshots. I've got some of your mugshots here actually in the SRS. Some very scary mugshots. Do you know where the term mugshots come from? Because it's particularly scary. Do you know where the term mugshot comes from? The term mugshot comes from when they introduced photography in police stations. Obviously they wanted to take pictures of the suspect so they could use these as evidence in the future. What the suspects used to do, they realised what was going on here. They thought, well, I'm not going to have my photo taken because this is something that can capture me and be used against me. So what they used to do is, the suspect would actually, they'd literally be on a chair, they'd be forced to such a chair that you'd have detectives pinning them down to the chair. So what they used to do is they used to pull funny faces, they used to mug their face so that their faces become so distorted that the pictures wouldn't be able to be used by the police as evidence. That's where the term mugshot comes from. Photography also was used again in this project to provide what's called composite portraiture. I've got some pictures here that I'll show you next week. What they did is they got pictures of, say, a rapist, different rapists, so 10 rapists. So they've got their profile pictures, and they would merge the negatives onto each other. So 10 negatives, 10 negatives, 10 negatives. And eventually what you would get was the outline of the typical rapist, the typical murderer, the typical arsonist. They believed then that these physical characteristics, we were able to tell the outward signs of inborn criminal nature. Again, going back to the context, again, we keep going back to it. The drivers then, the context is the driver to this. You're living, if you move from these rural communities to the urban community, this presents us with distinct challenges. Here you know everyone. Here, you're scared shitless. You don't know anyone. It's a dangerous place. It seems as though everyone's out to rob you. Really dangerous place. So increasingly people want to have kind of manuals to work out who's good and who's bad. And so you get things like the detective novels at this time. Things like, what's it, Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes. These become really, really popular because people believe that you could actually tell by looking at people whether or not they were good or whether they were bad, whether they were out to get you. Could you actually see by somebody's face whether or not they could be trusted or not? So, this was driven by this context then, by all these factors. Okay, now next week, what we're going to do next week is we're going to explore in much more detail some of the studies that were done under this kind of biological and psychological positivism. So I'll give you factual studies. We'll explore this in a bit more detail. But perhaps more importantly, for your purposes, we'll be looking at the assessments. Okay? Could I also mention to you yet again, for those of you that haven't done it, hold on, I'm not finished. Please make sure that you look at the article that's on Blackboard by Jock Young, okay, thinking seriously about crimes and models of criminology. It really will help with your assignment if you've not done so. You must look at that. Thank you.